Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. This week I'm here with Tom Sheppard, who you're probably familiar with because he's popping up everywhere, all over social media, all over YouTube. And this is one of the guys that I literally couldn't wait to sit down and talk to and pick his brain because he's somebody that wants to be good at everything. And I should say he is good at everything. And when I do say that, I'm not just being a nice guy. I'm not just blowing smoke. I'm not just trying to compliment him because he's on the show. I'm saying this is somebody that has a grasp of training, of nutrition, of modern day PED utilization for both the athlete and the everyday person. He's part of this kind of new era of coaches that we're seeing starting to emerge, which is, I don't want to speak negatively, but it's amongst a sea of less than stellar information that's out there. But he's one of the shining lights that is basically bringing you guys information that's coming from all facets and is applicable to all people. And he's doing it based on science, practical experience. He's doing it the right way. And before he got too popular and I couldn't get him on the show or couldn't get him to answer a DM, I wanted to make sure that I got him now so I could bring him to you guys that might not have been able to experience his content yet, so we can dive in and pick his brain on everything. But before we do that, Tom, can you give me a little bit more background on yourself? What kind of brought you into the coaching and the education space? Like, what brought you here?
Sure. Well, I mean, the journey starts with lifting, right? And like most people, I got into the gym for self-flagellation and to fight some demons that we all have. And it just became an all-encompassing kind of passion from there. I was at university studying biology, and then I did a internship as an S&C coach alongside that. And then when it kind of got to the end of my degree, it was like, well, I'm spending more time doing this stuff on the side as like an S&C coach for like the rugby team and all this type of stuff than I'm dedicating to my degree. I still did well in my degree, but it was like it wasn't where my passion lay anymore. So I decided to go down the route of like personal training and strength training. But then it kind of almost came full circle in the end because, you know, I'm probably like 16 years or so into this now, and I've kind of transitioned slowly from purely lifting and strength-based work with individuals now to this kind of more, I don't know, all-encompassing or holistic approach where, you know, we're dealing with their lifestyle, their supplementation, their nutrition, their PEDs, their peptides, you know, all this type of stuff. So it just turned out that having that biology degree came in really handy when I started diving down all of those rabbit holes, even taking the biology side out of it, just learning how to read and critique scientific research and all that type of thing, because we all know how much of a minefield that is, just came in so handy. And I am so grateful that I did that alongside now and have that background to fall back on. And it's helped me kind of try to blend all these worlds together in what I kind of think is my own way, whatever that may be. So it's kind of happened by accident in a way, but at the end of the day, when you're very invested in your clients and their progress, and you know they are invested very much also, all of this stuff becomes all encompassing. Like if you really want to be as strong or as muscular or aerobically fit or as lean or whatever it might be, like all of these things end up bleeding into each other. They might have different levels of importance at different phases of your journey. Like, you know, during the tail end of a competition prep, health goes out the window to a small degree or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, your ability to tolerate all of this stuff in the long term all cycles back to this kind of foundational element of, are you doing all of the basic things that allows a human body and brain to function at a high level in whatever the thing is that you choose to go and specialize in? So it's been a really fun journey, and it just keeps getting more and more fun as this goes on. And I would say the path just seems to get longer and longer the more you walk down it. You know, it's the typical, for every one thing you learn, you realize there's like 10 things you don't. And that, so far, that never seems to end. But I love that because it just means there's this endless realm of possibility of things that we could look to improve and help people with. So that's why I'm in for the long term, in for life, I guess.
Hey guys, full disclosure, this is kind of a commercial, but it's me interrupting myself, so I think that makes it okay. I don't know, whatever. I want to talk to you really quickly about the DDT Method School Group. Social media is getting weird these days. On Instagram, on YouTube, on really any platform, anytime I mention anything that sounds like milligram or protocol, I tend to get some sort of warning or red flag or even temporarily banned. So just to avoid that and still to be able to give you guys the information that you want, I started the DDT Method School Group. 2 days per week, I'll be dropping content from multiple different angles, exclusive videos, exclusive podcasts, exclusive articles, all this information that I put together, giving you guys protocols, dosages, and in-depth profiles of your favorite peptides and PEDs. That's the DDT Method School Group. Click the link below. Let's talk training first, because we're in this really weird time for training where the dogmatic or vocal minority or whatever you want to refer to it as on social media, and maybe it's just the algorithm pushing certain things, they want to speak about there being one specific way to best achieve hypertrophy, one specific way to best achieve strength, one specific way to best achieve body composition, although training in a metabolic style gets barely any coverage online for whatever reason. But everybody's just like, this is the way to do it. Now, I'm very interested in your opinion on how to structure training based on the fact that, as you mentioned, you are a strength and conditioning coach, but have now worked with people basically achieving or fighting to achieve maximal hypertrophy or just want this lean body composition. So let's look at it through the lens of somebody that's not necessarily an athlete or a bodybuilder, but more so the modern day biohacker in a world where, and I hate that term, but in a world where that's becoming more popular in that everybody's starting to realize that we have this ability, we can maximize everything. I want to be muscular, but I want to be really lean, but I want to be a badass in the boardroom, mentally cognizant. I want to feel good, look good, have energy. I don't want to compromise my health to an unreasonable degree, et cetera, et cetera. So just take like a man or woman that is maybe in decent shape, but they want to be super jacked, but also kind of strong, but also have energy and whatnot. How are you structuring their training? Because there's so much information out there that conflicts each other.
Sure. I think it's easier sometimes, and all of those individuals who are maybe putting those quite unique modal ideas forward, none of them are wrong. The hard thing is that they're all actually right. They're just maybe incomplete parts of the picture. And the way I would look at this for this kind of individual is, we can assume if they're coming to a coach or whatever and they want to be superhuman, we can probably assume they're at least like late 20s, probably more like in their 30s, because no one wants to be superhuman when they're 21 because they already are. It's not until those abilities start to degrade and you realize what you once had, well, you want that back and then maybe more. And you start to realize that you're human a little bit. So an easier way for individuals sometimes to look at this can be, let's look at all the physical capacities that really encompass everything that you're talking about there. As we go through that aging process, what actually starts to degrade? And then what do we put in place to stop that degradation, first off? And then we can have that minimal effective dose in there. And then we can tailor it up and down kind of then based on what our superfluous goals might be that we want to go beyond that. Like, even if your goal is just pure aesthetics and pure hypertrophy, there is going to be a baseline level of like rate of force development, aerobic fitness, mobility, movement quality, all this type of stuff that if you don't do enough to maintain it now, it will degrade to a point where it ends up inhibiting that goal later on. So for me, the first one that would go in there would be some form of like plyometric or power-based work, because that is the absolute first thing that's going to start to degrade. We're going to start losing those type 2X muscle fibers. We're going to lose that really high-end neural processing speed and the motor neuron rate of conduction, all that type of thing. So we would put in there like some really low-grade plyometrics. Like, it can be as simple as like box jumps or banded kettlebell swings, overhead medicine balls. Like, we don't need to be doing these like Instagram, athlete off-season special exercises or anything like that. We don't need to be doing Bosch cleans and weird things like that. All we need to do is do an exercise where we can create a high rate of force development in open or closed chain, whatever suits them, and just do enough of that to stop that degradation, which, could literally be as little as 3 sets of 5 reps of like box jumps or incline plyo push-ups, at the beginning of every single training session. That might just be enough if your goal isn't really power related to just plug that in there. There you go. Now you've got a warm-up that is ticking that box, but also putting your nervous system in a state where you can perform well at whatever the main task that comes after it is. Then when we kind of look past power and we say we've got that kind of ticked off, the main thing that we're trying to fight then is really like sarcopenia and the loss of mobility as we get older. Now, in reality, they're the same thing, because as we get older, we lose muscle tissue by losing sarcomeres in series. So basically what that means is your muscle fibers get shorter. That's how you lose this muscle tissue. So not only are you getting, you're losing your gains, as it were, but those muscles then are getting progressively tighter over time. So if we look at this individual, and let's say we have no idea what their primary goal is, other than right now we just need to do enough to keep them at baseline so they can decide what their priority needs to be, all that's going to mean is doing enough hypertrophy style work through a full range of motion to some form of stretch position that allows us to maintain that muscle length and maintain that muscle tissue. Now, for me, the easiest way to do that is to just put some form of loaded stretching in your warm up, or just have an entire workout dedicated to it in the week if you wish. But like, if your warm up consists of, like, let's take those incline plyo push ups and then like a 3-minute dumbbell bench press loaded stretch, you kind of tick those boxes already. Like, you've kept that mobility, or you could put 1 or 2 or more in there if you want. But let's just say for this upper body workout, we've maintained that mobility, we've maintained that level of power production, and that might have taken us like less than 10 minutes. And that's probably enough, as long as we're also probably doing some other movements that are taking those muscle groups through a full range of motion. Like, we're not doing only like floor presses or board presses, whatever it might be. That's probably going to be enough. Then if we say like that's kind of the warm-up stack now, it's ticked those boxes for us. We just want to move on to, let's say we really want to maximize like that strength and hypertrophy realm. That's where most of our interest kind of lays there. Then, the hard truth for people to get their head around is that there's just 1,000 different ways to do this. And it all kind of works. What I would say is, if I had to just like sit here and put my flag in the sand and say like this one thing does it better than anything else, like if you're someone who is a busy professional, you don't have all the time in the day to train, maybe you don't want to be in the gym all day, working up to percentages that are like, say, 75 to 85%, what is typically looked at as like their power building zone. Well, it kind of got that name for a reason, because those loads are heavy enough to give us a lot of the neurological adaptations that come with heavy strength training. Like, sure, there is going to be significant and specific benefits to going like 90, 95% and above. But for the average trainee who doesn't have like a competition or a test, going higher than 85% is not going to give you an awful lot more. We can probably look at it as a zone in which you're going to build strength rather than look to display strength. And one of the reasons that it builds strength as opposed to helps display it is because if we stay in that like 75 to 85% range, we can also do enough training volume that we can accumulate volume then to stimulate hypertrophy also. So we can kind of tick both of those boxes with something really basic. I mean, like I said, there are 1,000 different ways you can do that. But, if all else being equal, if someone has the temperament for it, I tend to lean towards like a more like sub-maximal strength skill style approach, purely because it's less stressful. Like, if you go in the gym and, you have to do like 5 rep maxes or 5x5 at really challenging percentages. If you're 10% down today because you got a day full of meetings like you're having, you're in your 6th meeting in a row or whatever it might be, then maybe you're not hitting those weights. Whereas if we are working at, let's say 80% is just like a bog standard example there, then at that percentage, we're already getting like maximal fiber recruitment, even if we do a single rep. So we can say, well, okay, we've already kind of ticked that box of maintaining our strength at a reasonable level by recruiting all those motor units and getting the fast twitch fibers. Great. So now if I'm just doing sub-maximal sets of like 2 at 80%, for most people, that's going to be anywhere between like a 5 or maybe even an 8 rep max, depending on their muscle fiber breakdown. Well, then we can just accumulate volume there. And you would be absolutely amazed that when you are doing that sub-maximal work, how much volume you can actually accumulate there. And, if someone is kind of listening to this being like, I don't know what this looks like, I'm a bit lost, like, go and look up Doug Hepburn's progression model. Like, he literally took, I think he started at like 85%. I would advise most people start at 80 because we're not all Doug Hepburn, right? And he would do 8 sets of 2 and he just add 1 rep every week. And then by the end of the 9-week cycle, he's doing 8 sets of 3. And then he'd add the tiniest amount of weight and he'd do it all over again. And you know what? If all of us could go back in time to like maybe a year or 2 into our training journey, when, the beginner gains are kind of gone and now we have to actually start thinking about what we do. If we all started that program then, we'd probably all be way better off than we are now. It's just most of us don't have the temperament for it, or we have to make enough mistakes trying to get gains quicker before we realize that that's actually the fastest way to do it. So, if you really want to think about this, just go and do that on 1 lift per day. That's probably enough stimulus for your hypertrophy and your strength to keep you progressing in the long term. Most people will look at that as slow, but the reality is that actual progress, or if you say real or sustainable progress, however you want to put it, is painfully slow. I remember when we had Dr. Zach out on the podcast here at the Table Talk, he did a big meta-analysis on open powerlifting, and they found that, once you're past your first year of competing, provided you don't move up a weight category, because they were trying to control for people who put on a lot of muscle to put their lifts up. The average powerlifter was getting stronger at about 2% per year. And we can probably safely assume that a competitive powerlifter cares quite a bit about getting stronger. So they're putting a lot of their available resources into that, and they're still only getting stronger at 2% per year on average. So I don't say this to like depress people, because actually when you accept that, a lot of the pressure comes off, because you're like, okay, I'm exhausted today, whatever, but like all I have to do is do enough work that I'm, 0.5% better every 3 months, and then actually I'm on track. And then you kind of start to work back from there, and you're like, okay, that kind of changes your attitude towards these things a little bit. So if we've got this individual now who's doing like, a basic plyometric exercise at the beginning of their workout, they're doing like a loaded stretch or two to work on their mobility, because all of us need more mobility than we think. And then we've got kind of hypertrophy and strength covered there with just some 75 to 85% work. And again, when your technique's decent, you'd be amazed at the volume that you can stand in that range there. After that, you've almost kind of got carte blanche to do what you want. In reality, like if you want to push hypertrophy more, that's where you could plug in more hypertrophy work there. If you wanted more strength, that could be where you could bring an accessory workout specifically to push up that main lift. Or, if you kind of want to be a bit more well-rounded, that might be where you put like some circuit training in, God forbid you say like some kind of CrossFit WOD or something like that, if you're trying to work on your conditioning and stuff like that as well. That can be almost plug and play. And that is a template that almost anyone can fall into. And then outside of that kind of more lifting-based stuff, the cardiovascular work, for me, at least in my opinion, I think is possibly, at least when you look into like the textbook and the science research and you start looking at like sports-specific training, for me, energy systems is like the most overcomplicated subject in the whole of training. Like if you think we complicate hypertrophy training, go and read like books and articles on like energy systems. It will absolutely blow your mind. Like you need a PhD to read these things. But the reality is for most of us who are not trying to like place at the Olympics in the 100-meter sprint or be like a professional marathon runner or whatever else, you can probably break it down into like three pretty broad categories, right? You need to do your low intensity stuff. Like you need to spend time in a parasympathetic state, so like chilled out, moving your body, getting blood flow going, improving your beta oxidation, which is just the fancy term for your body's ability to utilize fat. That is literally walking. Like and I would say actually for most people, it's going to be relaxed walking too, not even like brisk, like I'm on a mission kind of walk. It's go outside, get some sun, touch some grass, and get your steps in. Breathe through your nose, because that's important too. Like just accumulate time doing that. Sure, if you want to do it on a treadmill before the end of your workout, whatever, it doesn't really matter, but just accumulate time. The step count kind of works for that, to be brutally honest with you. Like people kind of like to look down on it, but for most of us, we don't do that enough. And if that's the thing that makes you get out of your seat and move around and start accumulating this low intensity cardio, then power to you. It doesn't really matter. Then we've kind of got this middle zone, then moderate intensity cardio. The part where we're kind of like 120, 140 beats per minute. If your buddy's on the treadmill next to you, you can kind of talk to them, but your breathing's a bit labored and all this type of thing. Like that is there primarily for most of us to practice your heart wall expanding and contracting. Like we want to maintain the elasticity of the heart wall. And, yes, we can get that with high intensity training to some degree, but how much high intensity training can you do? Not a lot. We can't spend enough time really expanding and contracting that heart wall at those high intensity levels. So enter the moderate intensity zone. And again, that could be once or twice a week, like 20, 30 minutes. Or if you prefer like your faster paced training, then you could just do, like, for example, I'm doing right now, all of my strength training is done in like EMOMs. So it's like 80% for doubles, but it's done in like alternating fashion with EMOMs. My heart rate is like 130, 140 for about 35 minutes of like total strength training. That ticks that box right there and then, if you want to do something like that. If you don't want to stand on the cross train or whatever and get it done, then you could look at things like loaded carries. Like loaded carries are probably the single most underutilized training tool we have. I mean, they can do literally anything you want them to. You can load them super heavy and treat them like a strength exercise. You can do them for slightly longer durations and get a really good hypertrophy stimulus out of them, especially because of the hypoxia and the constant tension. And the cool thing about that is, well, there's no real lengthened state. There's no lengthened position. There's no eccentric. So the muscle damage and the recovery side of them is incredibly easy. So if you're someone with poor recovery ability, high stress, or just someone who wants to be able to really train a lot, like loaded carries are going to be one of those methods where you can, pump up the volume on them really well and get that adaptation if you want. But then if you want to use them for your cardio, well, then you can just do them for time. You can start off with like a 1-to-2 rest ratio, like a farmer's walk for a minute, 2 minutes off, whatever. And I would say personally, if you're going to treat them that way, a good way of approaching it would be aiming to get to like a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So you're like minute on, minute off. And then once you can do that, well, then just start going heavier. You probably don't need to go lower on your rest than that. Otherwise, we're just going to turn it into this exercise where it's possibly too aerobic, for want of a better word, and we're going to limit the load too much. So once you get there, you can just start cranking the weight up. If you get too fit, then that's a good problem to have.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, then we'd come into that high intensity cardiovascular work, which really is the main thing that's doing for us is improving our ability to use oxygen and use glucose. So like nutrient partitioning and the efficiency in which you kind of transport and absorb oxygen, for want of a better way to put it. And that, again, can be brutally simple and can be so short-lived. Like for the average person, if you did, say, 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off for like 4 minutes, once or twice a week, you are covered. You're done. So really what we've done there, even in someone who has no interest in being a super high performer in cardiovascular work, but they want to be feeling their best, be able to handle a lot of training volume, whatever it might be, well, then it's okay, well, make sure you walk enough and get enough steps. Do your nasal breathing whilst you do it. You can either get on the cross trainer twice a week for like 20 minutes, or do some kind of like more circuit based, higher heart rate based lifting work, and then spend 4 to 8 minutes of your week on the assault bike or battle ropes, like just hating your life, because that's exactly how it should be. And then all your aerobic needs are covered. I mean, sure, if you want to go and get to the CrossFit Games, that's probably not going to be enough. But for the average person who wants to be able to like run after their kid or like play flag football at the weekend and also be, should we say, metabolically or aerobically fit enough to do like 12-hour work days and still perform well, that is going to be absolutely plenty. And it's really not that time consuming. It's really not that complicated. But unfortunately, if you kind of delve too far into any of those individual modalities, it suddenly looks very complicated, but it really doesn't have to be that way. So in reality, that could be a template that almost anyone could pick up. You could plug and play your own, should we say, preference of lifting work in there. Like, for example, we've got like you've got the high intensity hypertrophy crowd, we've got the volume based crowd, and then we've got the people who just say like, get stronger and you'll get bigger. They're all right. Like, which one do you want to do? I mean, the reality is that we would probably all benefit from doing all of them physically. Like there's an advantage to doing volume based. There's an advantage to doing intensity based. There's an advantage even from a pure hypertrophy standpoint to getting stronger. But you can spend different amounts of time in each of those phases. Like if your goal is to be an IFBB pro, you probably don't have to spend a lot of time in that kind of load-based, that heavier work zone. But even as little as like 4 weeks could have a lot of neurological benefits that then bleed back down into your more volume-based phases and things like that. And the reality is that for this individual, they can tailor that stuff to what the rest of their life is like right now. Like, you said you've just started like a new business up, stress is high, time is low. Well, maybe now is a good time to do like a high intensity phase. You can go in and it could be all machine based. There's nothing wrong with that if we're just after hypertrophy. You can go 1 set to failure. And let's be realistic. You can get a session in 30 minutes, no problem there. Like if you've warmed up on machine chest press, then you're 1 set to failure, you can probably jump into your lat raises, your tricep push downs, and whatever else. You probably don't even have to warm up if you don't want to. I'm not saying you should do that, but I'm saying if you've got this incredible time pressure or low resources, that is entirely possible. And then when life stress is lower, time availability is higher, maybe that's when we transition to like a more volume-based phase. We try and get all the benefits out of that, and then we can just kind of cycle back and forth between it. It doesn't have to be this kind of black and white, yes or no, all or nothing approach. I mean, I always think it's really funny that we go through cycles like this. Like if you read Arthur Jones's materials, he talks about how like all the bodybuilders would come to him and they were like trying to mimic the high volume phases at the time because that was the thing. They would all come to him massively overtrained, completely flat, completely broken down. Well, he'd have them sit on the beach for a week and they'd already put on like 4 pounds and look better. And then he'd train them using his high intensity approach, which was very high intensity to be fair, but just like one set to failure. And they grew on it because that was a new stimulus for them. But then if everyone was doing that, you'd have another coach over here doing the high volume phase that everyone would be gravitating towards. And lo and behold, all those athletes would be blowing up when they went and trained with them too, because the answer isn't either or, it's both. You've just got to learn to kind of phase between them and not get too bogged down in being too loyal to any of these training systems, because all of these training systems exist and have existed for decades for a reason. If intensity-based training didn't work, if volume-based training didn't work, if basic strength training didn't work, we wouldn't be doing it 50 or 60 years later. It would have naturally kind of been bled out. But we're all still here arguing about them for a reason. And that reason is that they do something that the other methods don't do. So that would be sorry, that was one hell of a tangent that you didn't get any word in edgeways there. But if anyone is taking anything away from this, is that it can be a lot simpler than you think, and it all works. You've just got to fit it together in a framework that you can recover from, and then the rest will take care of itself.
To be perfectly honest with you, as somebody that's brutally confident in my ability to contribute to any conversation in the space, I did not need to say a word there, and anything I would have said would have just taken away from it. I don't know if I was like the 5th person to ask you that question or whatever it might be, but that was like the most perfectly articulated, all-encompassing, here's the template for how you should train and how you should navigate your training. So I cannot tell you how much I agree with that. It very much speaks to me in the same way that something that Andy Triana said on a podcast episode months ago, where he mentioned the importance of being, quote unquote, all sorts of jacked. You should be every type of jacked. You should be proficient in really every realm of conditioning, every cardio zone, if you do want to refer to it as that, every lifting modality, but it's all about kind of catering it to the season, catering it to the specific goal. So I always look at it kind of like a pie chart where we have one predominant slice of the pie that's larger based on the goal of the individual, and then all the other slices are there, but it's this living and breathing thing. One of my favorite things to do, I don't take a lot of people one-on-one for training anymore, but one of my favorite things to do when I was doing that predominantly, especially when I was doing a lot of training with bodybuilders at MI40 gym in Tampa years ago when it was predominantly a personal training gym, would be to take somebody that had a tremendous strength in the bodybuilding world that was used to one specific modality of hypertrophy training and to kind of watch their heart rate during training. And they would maintain a pretty decent, pretty expected heart rate for hypertrophy style training. And then I would give them a 20-pound medicine ball and just say just give me 20 med ball slams. Heart rate would be like 190. They're about to stroke out because it's an energy system that they're not used to operating in and pushing themselves in, and they're just not proficient in that. And in Andy Triana's words, they're not jacked in that type, so they're not proficient in that area. So having everything represented in a way that makes sense is incredibly important. Now, to go a little bit deeper on that one before we switch gears over to performance enhancement, peptides, et cetera, how do you like to program this, and how does that change based on the individual? And let me specify that by saying, do you like to program something that is all-encompassing towards one goal at a time? And let's say, again, it's for the individual that just wants to be jacked and optimal. It's not for a bodybuilder, not for a powerlifter. Do we go through a block of training that's more metabolic or conditioning-based, and then a block of training that's more hypertrophy-based, and then a block of training that's more hypertrophy-based? Or do you like to program it where we're doing more of a hybrid style, where there's a hypertrophy day, a strength day, a conditioning day? And if it depends, what does it depend on? Is there different cases for different individuals? How do you approach the programming?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of individual variation there. For me, it's more often like the psychological profile that plays more of a role in that. Like someone like myself, who you can probably tell from the appearance, tends to be like all in on stuff like tattoos, whatever else, right? Music has to be like 100 miles an hour and all in. When you're coaching people like that, the idea of like a balanced or a moderated workout is really not enticing to them. Like if they want to have like a leg day where like it's like heavy squats and then destroy your legs, and they want to like not be able to walk the next day, and like that's fine. That can work. That can work perfectly well. And you've got other individuals who are, that should we say, if you're on the extreme end, would be like down towards the anxiety side of the spectrum. The idea of them coming in and doing a huge amount of volume on one body part or lifting excessively heavy for the entire session is probably going to be like their worst nightmare. It's too neurologically taxing. There's a whole spectrum in between there too. So for me, I do prefer a more hybrid approach when possible, purely because the average person doesn't have that much time in the gym, or rather, they could, for the level of development that they wish to achieve, and I mean this in no derogatory sense at all, they probably don't need to be in there for as long as they may theorize that they do. Like when you're a competitive powerlifter peaking for me, sure, you might have some 3-hour squat sessions. Like at some point, there is no way really around that. But like if you're in your off season, or you don't have like a specific goal to be tapering up to things like that, there's absolutely no reason you can't tick multiple boxes at once. So for example, a very one that I really like, we've already mentioned like the Doug Hepburn progression system. Like go run that, start it now, and in 10 years time, you'll be the strongest person in the world. Now you can take something like that and say, well, I can only train say 3 days a week. I don't have a huge amount of time. What can I do with this? It's like, well, okay, well, let's just take like a push movement, a pull movement, and a leg movement. It could be as simple as like a floor press, a chin up, and like a trap bar deadlift, right? Well, why don't we just take that Hepburn progression system that we know works, and we just plug that into that circuit? So now we're doing 8 rounds of these 3 compound movements. We're only doing 2 reps. It's submaximal. So because they have to go between motor tasks, we don't want things to be too maximal anyway, because the performance will drop. But it's like a 6-rep max, and they're doing sets of 2. Great, let's go through that. And let's say in 45, maybe 50 minutes, if it's taking them much longer than that, they went too heavy, or they're just being lazy and checking their Instagram too much, then in 45 to 50 minutes, they've got 24 work sets at about 80%, and they've depending on what stage of that progression system they're in, they've gotten anywhere between 48 and 72 maximally effective reps, which from a hypertrophy standpoint is enormous for their whole body. And that, for their strength and hypertrophy purposes, is them done. Like I said, then we can add in that little bit of mobility work. We can add in a little bit of aerobic work at the end, but sometimes those might not even be needed based on how aerobically demanding that circuit might be. And if we're choosing our exercise as well, then they might also not need that much mobility work either. Like, for example, if we're choosing like a full range of motion Romanian deadlift or stiff leg deadlift, or like a Frankenstein or a front squat that's being done to very good depth, maybe something like dips or dumbbell presses, we're taking all of those joints through like really full ranges of motion to start with. So we may not even need any mobility work reality outside of that, other than to like maybe target some areas that are a problem. And those can usually be put on a separate day. So for me, when we look at something like that, I try to look at it for the average person in terms of like, what's my return on investment per minute in the gym? Like, how much of my training session do I actually spend doing the thing that's stimulating what I want versus warming up, swapping exercises, all of this other stuff? Now, for that person who's doing that kind of like 3 exercise circuit there, well, okay, sure, maybe it's 15, 20 minutes to warm up, but then you've got 45 to 50 minutes there, what is essentially constant effort. And you come out of it with like, whatever we said, 24 sets done, 50 maximally effective reps in the space of about an hour. You're going to struggle to find a system that's going to give you better return on that. So that's why I do really like, you could call them like strength circuits, you can call it whatever you want, but I think there is something to be, and this maybe is a training method that doesn't get talked about enough, like the ability to lift reasonably heavy loads submaximally, but at a good cadence and a good tempo with a moderate heart rate, probably does just about everything most people need. Now, if we're looking at someone who's like more specialized and they want to go through periods where they maximize their hypertrophy or they maximize their strength, then sure, we can kind of take a more specialized approach. Or we could look at this like, again, let's take that. And I don't mean that the Hepburn progression model is the only one that works, but let's stick with a singular example for the sake of the listener. If that's already plugged in, our strength and hypertrophy needs are probably already reasonably well met. But let's say now I'm going through a phase where it's like, dude, I just want to get jacked, like as jacked as humanly possible. It's like, well, cool. Your first hour of your workout is non-negotiable because that just kind of ticks all the boxes. Gives you some aerobic fitness, gives you some hypertrophy, gives you some strength. Wonderful. But now let's say you've got an extra 30 minutes in the gym. Okay, well, this is what we fill our time with now. And if we got 30 minutes, maybe that's going to be like a more high intensity style. It could be doing, I think you said you were talking to Scott Stevenson earlier, like that could be like doing muscle rounds on a couple of different cable or machine exercises. Like you find me a more time efficient hypertrophy stimulus than that. There's not many. You probably got time to spare at the end there to jump on the battle ropes or the assault bike or whatever it might be. So I do think that there is a big benefit to keeping a reasonable amount of these things stimulated at all times. And I would say the main reason for this is that as humans, we tend to be drawn to extremes progressively over time and then neglect things. It's not that we can't be trusted, but it's just that let's take the typical powerlifter example, right? Like you're doing all the right things, you're getting slowly stronger over time, and then lo and behold, you're like, one day you're like, you know what, I'm just going to stop doing accessory work. I don't have the time, whatever it might be. So that person just starts doing their main lift and maybe like their main accessory. All that other stuff drops out. Well, what happens? Cumulative fatigue comes down. And in the short term, their performance goes up. And they're like, dude, like I'm getting better. I'm getting stronger. Like this is good. So then we ingrain the habit of like, oh, I'm just not going to do that stuff because that was holding me back. Well, it wasn't. It was building the stuff that you're now seeing now that you're not fatigued. And we tend to progressively go further down this rabbit hole until we inevitably end up injured or broken or just not recovering or getting any progress. And then we're like, well, what am I not doing now? Oh, yeah, all that stuff I cut out 2 or 3 months ago. So I prefer to have like a non-negotiable baseline in there of these things, just to say, right, you can do outside of these things, we can focus on whatever you want, but let's not take out the pillars that are supporting your progress at that higher level of functioning in whatever the thing is that you want to go after. And then we don't have to go through this process of like plateauing and stagnating and problem solving, because we're trying to solve all the problems before they come up by keeping all of those things in check. And I'm not saying there's not a time to ever specialize, but that's probably where we should be 80 to 90% of the time. And then there's going to be competitions, there's going to be tests, there's just going to be periods like you getting married in 4 weeks, or whatever it might be. But yet at that point, you've kind of bought your right to specialize then, because you've done everything else for long enough that you've kind of got this window of opportunity where you can neglect things for a short period of time and still reap the benefits of it. But the problem is most of us are trying to short circuit that and trying to reap those benefits of specializing without building the pyramid underneath them that allows us to do that. So that's generally why for the average person, the approach is going to be reasonably well-rounded. It's generally going to be either whole body or like upper lower or push pull. And when I say push pull, usually then we're talking like squats are in with push or hinges are in with pull, for example, because that just allows us to do all of these things to a high enough level and frequently enough to actually get good at them. Because I think that's another kind of facet of this that doesn't get talked about is everyone should be aiming for movement mastery to some level, because that is the fundamental basis of all the things that you're trying to do. You want to be a great marathon runner, then you need to work on your stride. You want to be really strong and jacked. Well, if your squats are in your program, you need to squat well. It doesn't matter whether you're doing German volume training or heavy singles. You still need to squat well, because that's going to A, get you the stimulus you want, and B, allow you to tolerate enough workload that you can actually create the stimulus that's large enough to get the thing that you want. So then when we're kind of peeling that back, and if we now say that movement mastery is some kind of fundamental aspect of whatever these fitness endeavors might be, then we probably do need to practice them in some variety more than once per week. And I'm not saying you need to back squat 2 or 3 times a week, but that could be like on Monday, it could be like a front squat or a front foot elevated split squat. It could be anything that has the word squat in it. It doesn't really matter. It's all kind of the same thing at the internal fundamental level. And then, later on in the week could be your actual squat day where you're back squatting, and that's the main focus. But I don't think the average person is technically proficient enough to worry about like specializing in singular movements or movement patterns that are performed at low frequency, because they're the level of skill acquisition that's in front of them has probably bigger returns than whatever the thing is that they're worried about that they could get from doing those movements less frequently. And we even get that a lot of powerlifters that come out here. You get a comment like, "Oh man, I can't deadlift more than once a week." And it's like, well, okay, let's just stop right there. If deadlifting is 1/3 of your sport, would it not be beneficial if you could do it more than once per week? Like, that's just, if you were a sprinter, it would be nice if you could sprint more than once a week, or throw 3 throws if you're a basketball player. Like, that would be a good thing. So why don't we just start peeling that back and go, why can't you deadlift more than once a week? Most of the time it's poor technique or poor programming. Like, they're just doing too much volume and too much load, or more often than not, the underlying movement pattern's not good enough. If we address that, then all of a sudden, like doing Romanian deadlifts one day, trap bar deadlifts the other day, whatever it might be, suddenly becomes so much more approachable, and all these new options now open. But we never get those cool options if we just accept that, oh, my deadlift is probably kind of trash, but I'm just going to like get stronger at it and hope for the best. So I think that needs to be an underlying viewpoint, even for those who are purely based on aesthetics. For example, at some point you're going to be doing a free weight or a compound movement, and your ability to execute those well is going to determine whether you get the stimulus you want. Like, let's take a front squat. Like, sure, you can front squat for your quads. Absolutely. It's a great exercise. If you're front squatting and your ass is shooting up in the air, and then you're basically doing a front-sided good morning as you come out of that squat, well, now your quad exercise isn't doing anything, at least for what you want. So then, we get back to that, like, well, how well are you technically executing the things you're doing? Like, that level of quad development you're going to get from that is dependent on that too. So to me, that's where the whole body or higher frequency of movement pattern kind of comes into it, because for me, I'm yet to find a person who doesn't have room to grow in terms of their technical proficiency and doesn't have things to be gained from doing that, even if it's kind of indirectly.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think a lot of this comes down to having a thought process and an understanding. And if you have those things, then addressing situations with individuals in terms of programming and setting up their training, it becomes something that it's a science, but it's an art at the same time. And that's really what gives you the ability to zero in and get results for an individual. And again, it's in a landscape of people just parroting what they see on social media and in reels and just saying, do this because it's the best way to do that. We're seeing a lot of the same thing in the supplement world now, especially with the availability of peptides and all these new small molecules that we have access to. And people are just saying, this is great for this, so do it. Now, there's a lot more going on under the hood with a lot of these substances than people think. Now, this is another podcast in and of itself. So we're going to have to get you back on here to do the deep dive in performance enhancement and peptides and whatnot. But with the availability of everything at everybody's fingertips right now, what do you think some of the peptides in either the mitochondrial category, the growth hormone category, more recovery-based categories, what do you think are some of the most applicable but still have to be understood and applied correctly? Like, what are some of your favorites that are taking the world by storm right now?
Sure. Well, if we go back to our example of like the quote unquote biohacker wants to be great everywhere, again, we can kind of peel this back in the same way with the training. Like, what are the things that stop us being superhuman? Let's not aim for super physiological when we're probably not optimal just at a physiological standard to start with. Like, what are the baselines that kind of degrade as our lifetime goes on? And the first thing we're probably going to look at there is, like, mitochondrial function will decrease. Basically, but by the time you hit anywhere between 30 and 40, all of these things are going to start getting worse, whether you like it or not. So let's go ahead and start putting the Band-Aids on these and improving them. So then we can start aiming for like superhuman. First, we've got to be baseline like human. Like, let's aim to be what we were when we were 21. And then we can worry about going Super Saiyan after that. So the first one would be mitochondrial function. Now for that, you need to be aerobically fit. And then you've got great players. Things like urolithin A is probably the single best one there for like an over-the-counter, that's going to help with your mitochondrial repair and the biogenesis of making new mitochondria, because that's important too. It's kind of hard to go wrong with that, like 500 to 1,000 milligrams of that per day. Very few people are going to have any adverse effects to that, and there's not really going to be any problems there. I would say on top of that, the other big benefit from mitochondrial health, other than being aerobically fit, then is going to be something like a red light device. Like the light conversation is one to have another day, but red light, especially near infrared, is going to be really beneficial for mitochondrial health. And, 15 to 20 minutes of that per day can be incredibly helpful there. Then if we start looking at, should we say, more general health, well, then as we get older, all our natural anti-inflammatories and antioxidants start to decrease. I mean, sure, we can blast BPC if we really want to, or we can first look at that as a player that could come in later on and say, well, what are the baseline antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that I'm losing? Well, first off is going to be glutathione. Like our glutathione levels start to progressively drop in that age range as well. But that could be via injectable glutathione, which works best in, should we say, boluses, like infrequently. Anytime we're looking to suppress inflammation, assuming we're like a healthy, not chronically sick individual, we generally want to do it in boluses and infrequently, because not all inflammation is bad. And if we end up suppressing it too much, then we stop getting adaptation responses and then we create more problems than we solve. That was a big problem when BPC first came out and everyone was just blasting it constantly. And they're like, why am I getting worse? Why am I getting sicker? So on and so forth. If you don't want to go down the injectable route, then even just taking something like NAC, which will help donate cysteine to the creation of your own glutathione production, can be really helpful. And that, 800, 1200 milligrams per day is dirt cheap. That can be taken like with your first meal of the day. That will cover that base reasonably well. The other big anti-inflammatory that we start to lose then is superoxide dismutase. So that one doesn't get talked about much. There are actually supplements specifically for that now, one of which I'm trialing, which is quite cool. But that one, again, is a really important player in antioxidants and general health. That can be kept up reasonably well just with spirulina, like 2,000, 3,000 milligrams per day of a good quality spirulina supplement is going to do enough to help keep those levels up. Is it going to do as much as any of these injectable peptides might? Maybe not. But for the average person, that over-the-counter is going to work really well. Then what else starts to go? Okay.
Spirulina, big fan.
Yeah. Oh, you got it. Perfect. And I was going to say, then after that, what else starts to go down? Well, then we start to lose growth hormone. Now, ideally, most individuals, if we're looking at like a longevity, biohacking, quality of life long term, like we would look at using exogenous growth hormone long term. But people don't like to talk about the dosages that actually do this job because they're not sexy. Like it's 0.5 to 1 IU a day. Like that's all you need to keep that growth hormone production up high enough. Now, if you can't go down that route or you don't want to, then sure, things like ipamorelin and CJC can do that job really well there. Now, the other thing that's going to do really well then is help keep our thymic gland working well, which again, once you hit like 30, 35, that starts to go downhill. And yes, again, there are thymic peptides you can take. You can take the oral thymogen alpha-1, you can take thymolin, all these wonderful things. Or we can just look at it as like, let's stop the degradation in the first place and keep our growth hormone levels in a healthy place. That could be ipamorelin, CJC, any of those. The other thing that doesn't get talked about is actually using exogenous growth hormone and ipamorelin and CJC together, which can work really well because what you do is you potentiate the growth hormone receptors with the ipamorelin or the CJC, and then you go ahead and take your 0.5 or 1 IU growth hormone, and it amplifies the effect, but you don't get any of the side effects that might come along with higher IUs of growth hormone. And then, of course, we then inevitably end up falling on like the androgen, the sex hormone side of things, where most people, if they want to be performing at their absolute best long term, may well need some form of HRT, or if that's not an option, we could look at things like injectable L-carnitine, which can help sensitize your androgen receptors long term. Even BPC, a microdoses, actually sensitizes your androgen and your growth hormone receptors. Now, I know I mentioned don't do that long term because of inflammation, but there we're talking like 100, 200 micrograms a day. Basically, it binds the heat shock protein 90, kicks it off, and allows the androgens and the growth hormones to bind at a higher rate, which means you get more action. So let's say you're kind of borderline low testosterone, you don't want to go down the route of HRT and all that type of thing. Injectable L-carnitine and low dose BPC could well be enough for those individuals to bump those levels up enough to keep them in a good place. Things like Tongkat Ali, Shilajit for testosterone can work. You got things like Siberian rhubarb for bumping up estrogen. You got like chasterberry extract for bumping up progesterone. They get a bad rap as OTCs, like they don't work. But in my experience, that tends to be more dependent on how healthy the individual that it's going into. Like if you are a healthy person who just happens to have low estrogen or low testosterone, those over the counters can bump the needle in the right direction because everything else is already in place. You just have this kind of like one rate limiting factor. Whereas if you're unhealthy and you have all this inflammation, all these other problems that are in the way of that needle ticking upwards, then sure, you can take as much Tonka Ali as you want. You're not getting rid of all the other stuff that's inhibiting it. So those have a place, but you got to make sure you're doing all the other stuff right in the first place. And so, we've mentioned L-carnitine. That's probably one that just about everyone could benefit from. If we start,
Agreed.
We look away from the androgen side of things, it's going to improve your beta oxidation, so your ability to break down fat. It's also going to improve your ability to create ketones. So if you're doing any form of like low carb, like ketogenic diet, or you're doing lower calorie days for longevity or whatever it might be, the L-carnitine is going to improve your ability to break down and use fat, and it's going to improve your ability to create ketones, which obviously will provide fuel then for that day. The glutathione were probably the two that for me would be very hard to go wrong. The glutathione is the only kind of caveat with the glutathione is you just can't overdo it because then you end up suppressing that inflammation too much. Now, obviously the most common ones then are like BPC, TB500, GHKCU tend to get used a lot. All of them are great healing peptides. They just do it in slightly different ways. The BPC is more of like a pure tissue-based healer. The TB500 actually has really beneficial effects on like gene expression, neonatal gene expression. So basically all the genes that shut off as you get older, it helps turn them back on, which is great for like stem cell release and regeneration in just about every way. And then the GHKCU directly helps stimulate the release of your own stem cells, which you could make an argument for using those in boluses at periods forever. You could do like 1 month BPC and like a bolus dose to like help repair any lasting cumulative damage that you've accumulated. You could use a bolus then of TB500 like the next month to get the benefits for the gene expression. Then you could do the GHKCU the next month to get the benefits for the stem cells. All of them are going to be healing you. All of them are going to be doing it in slightly different ways. And then because we're doing it in a bolus, we don't have to worry about that chronic kind of down pattern in inflammation, which can actually hurt us in the long term. The scary thing about the peptide world, though, is just that, like every week there's a new one. And it's like the best thing ever. I would say the one that's probably going to become quite big in like the next maybe year or two is going to be clotho-protein.
Agreed.
Yeah, like that one, especially if you're a drug-tested athlete too. But that one, it's hard to find like a recovery or a longevity-based pathway that it kind of doesn't help. And if we're talking like clotho-protein peptide as opposed to recombinant clotho, you almost can't overdo it because it gets kind of capped at super physiological levels there. So that one I could see bleeding into the biohacking world like crazy in the next year or two, because that could replace a lot of other things. Like people might not need the urolithin A, the glutathione, all that stuff if that's in there from an early stage.
That one's so interesting. I have some clothopeptide in my fridge right now, and I have some recombinant clotho on the way. I'm going to do a lot of reading before I start applying them. But again, it's an ever-developing, incredibly fascinating industry. Again, you just have to understand how these things work and what's going on under the hood before applying them. We're going to have to get you in on one of the peptide roundtables that we have coming up. We'll talk about that a little bit off air. Sure. But Tom, thank you so much, man. This has been such an incredible deep dive, and that was such a good kind of like all-encompassing quick mini dive into the best way to approach gray area PEDs for really anybody trying to optimize. Amazing. It was like a 20-minute masterclass just kind of wrapped up perfectly. So we'll definitely get you back on for one of the roundtables. I'd love to sit down with you and a couple other the peptide guys and go over everybody's individual preferences on stacking and whatnot. So we'll be announcing that in the near future. In the meantime, Tom, where can everybody find you, find more of your information, find more of your content? Because a whole hell of a lot of people are going to want deep dive now, I'm sure.
Oh, sure. So I got one social media because one's enough for me. So I'm on Instagram. It's Tom_Kaizen. That's recently been renamed because Naomi and I are actually going to be launching our website, a new website brand, whatever you want to call it, which is called Train Kaizen. So that's also now on Instagram. We've just made that. So train_Kaizen. That website is going to be launched in the new year, maybe a little bit earlier. That's where we're going to be like, selling training programs, diet plans. It's going to be a hub for our online coaching and all our resources like that. Outside of that, most of my stuff then is on Elite FTS, like their YouTube channel, things like that. We've been here for just over 2 years now, which continues to be an absolutely fantastic experience, and I'm eternally grateful for this opportunity to be here. And it only continues to get better. So that's, outside of the Instagram, that's where most of our stuff is. I'm lucky enough to co-host some of the Table Talk episodes where we get to talk with individuals like yourself, about these deep dive topics there. So, we've had a couple of really good peptide coaches out onto the Table Talk where we had these conversations for God knows how many hours. The time just kind of flies. So that might be worth checking out for people who are interested in that too.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the DDT Method Podcast. We will see you guys next time.